We're going to be watching, looking at the Fed meeting coming up next week, is really the press conference that follows and what they're sharing in terms of the data that they've got and what they're looking at currently. Good afternoon. Hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving. We have the labor market data in focus right ahead of the Fed decision next week. So we'll talk a little about the labor market and kind of give a bit of a sneak peek of what we're really watching heading into that Fed press conference coming up next Wednesday. I'm Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue, and our goal is to leave you feeling more empowered after every interaction. And we set up these weekly updates just to kind of keep you up to date on what's happening in the markets, to hopefully weeding out some of the noise along the way as well. And this week might be a little bit shorter, although we'll spend a good amount of time on the question of the week really tied to the Fed conference coming up next week and what we're watching there. But there are a couple of important data points, and this week was a bit slower because we do have the markets were closed obviously last Thursday for Thanksgiving and then half day Friday. But markets did end November pretty strong, so a little bit of a dip in the middle of the month, but it picked back up towards the end there. And most of the data that we received this week revolves around the labor market. So two real things to cover. One is just yesterday on Wednesday, we received the ADP employment report. So this shows that there were 32,000 jobs lost basically last month. Now that is important to take note of, but keep in mind, again, this labor report is maybe weighed less heavily, let's put it, compared to the non-farm payrolls report that typically comes out. Now that has been delayed because of the government shutdown, and as far as I can see anyways, it doesn't look like we're going to get that for a short period of time here anyways still. So we may not get that ahead of the Fed meeting. But, it's important to factor in, but keep in mind, again, this has not always been the most accurate. There's been a lot of discrepancy between the two reports. I would say the market probably weighs the non-farm payrolls number a little bit higher, even though there are challenges with both sides of it. So anyways, 32,000 jobs lost for the month of November was the number that came out from the ADP employment report. And then today we had initial jobless claims as well. This shows actually down at 191,000, which was quite a bit below expectations. So labor market's showing a bit of conflicting data in a way. Last week we touched briefly that there was some signs that maybe the labor market wasn't as challenged as it might have looked. This week, it's hard to say. There's a little bit on both sides of the spectrum here. So we will definitely be keeping an eye on this. I'm very interested to see what the Fed talks about next week when they talk about the labor market, because again, with the government shutdown, we have been missing some of this data along the way, and looking forward to getting some of that back in as well here as we look on the horizon. But be sure to tune in next week. Before we talk a little bit about the Fed meeting coming up, we have a lot coming up next week, actually. So we have a bit of a glimpse into the consumer. We have more inflation and jobs data all right ahead of the Fed back in focus there for that decision and press conference on Wednesday. So we will have a lot to cover next Thursday. But before we break for the week, definitely want to give a bit of a preview of what we're watching heading into that Fed meeting next Wednesday. Obviously, the decision is important. What I will share is that there has been more conversations that the Fed may not cut. In fact, Fed Chair Powell has shared it's not a foregone conclusion. You might remember that from the prior meeting there not too long ago. So it'll be important to watch. I would say that the bets are maybe a little bit more on a cut than not. But it'll be very important to see what comes out of that, because it's not set in stone by any means. But I think the biggest thing that we want to watch here is what they signal, if anything, for a path in 2026. So from our perspective, that's really what we're going to be watching, looking at the Fed meeting coming up next week, is really the press conference that follows and what they're sharing in terms of the data that they've got and what they're looking at currently, but also how that translates into how they're viewing the year ahead. Because if they're going to signal anything towards continued rate cuts, we could see yields move quite a bit and stock markets move quite a bit on that news. If they're pretty close to the chest on that and saying we're just going to take it next meeting, it might be a little more subdued. So we'll continue to watch that, and we'll be sure to update you next Thursday.